Okay, welcome everybody to this online module for Standard Module A, Language, Identity and Culture. My name is Waffa Toby. I am currently working at Tempe High School. I've been a teacher for over 18 years now. I've worked with the English Teachers Association and other companies in terms of writing resources. So I am pretty good at understanding the different aspects of what is needed for the HSC and also for the new Australian curriculum. You are in for a treat with this particular text because it is an all-time classic, and if you have started already the module, you'll understand what I mean. But for those of you, I'm going to assume today that you actually haven't watched the film in its entirety, in terms of you've probably seen it once, but you haven't done a close study yet. If you have, that's great. You can add to your notes. If you haven't, obviously that's where I am coming from as well. So I'm going to take it right from the very beginning. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of our country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Okay, let's start with, first of all, what is language. The model is called Language, Identity and Culture. So before you start, you need to have a real understanding of how those three words connect. And really what we're looking at in this module is language first and foremost. And it's the way that language can be used in a direct way or it can be used in a subtle way. But at the end of the day, it's being used to shape a thought process. And that thought process is being used to shape a culture. Because we're studying film, we're not just looking at spoken language, we're also looking at the cinematic or the visual language. So that's really important. We're looking at things like tone, idiomatic expressions, but we're also looking at camera shots, close-up shots, mise-en-scene, and so forth. And what I mean about language is if you look at the column opposite, there are two ways we can say things, and often the way we say things can reference our culture, our background, even our educational level. So if we want to tell someone to move away from us, we can say shove it or I respectfully decline. That use of register, whether something is formal or informal, really very much tells us a lot about the speaker and their identity, the language that they use. We've got people, why are you moving like a sissy? And just that connotation of the word sissy references an attitude, a value system. And that's what, we're going to be looking at when we look at the castle. How do the words reveal the character, the identity, and the values behind them? We've also got Tony Abbott very famously saying Team Australia, and the idea of that was to create an exclusive identity. And I've just put down for you what I was talking about with idiomatic expressions. They're expressions that maybe people from other countries who come in might not have an understanding and might take it literally. And that's an example of something is raining very heavily. It's raining cats and dogs. And so what we start to see is language shaping a lot of the values in the castle. And I've just put down there for you some examples of the different kinds of values that the castle really talks about. A lot of them you will recognise, but one of the most important things I think to note when looking at this slide is a lot of these values and qualities are often associated with a working class identity, especially the idea of a battler kind of identity in terms of a group. But you can see there a lot of the values that we're going to talk about are straight in the castle, are straight from here. Okay, in terms of identity, well, you can see that your identity can be made up of lots of different things. So when you view the castle, think about how gender can frame that, or not so much religious belief in the castle, but race and ethnicity is definitely there, as is political beliefs, geography, and physical activity and class. They're big types of identity, and they're the kinds of social markers that you look at when you're looking at how Australian identity has been created in this text. And lastly, culture. So we've looked at language, identity, and now culture. Well, culture can be seen in two different ways. It can actually be visible, so costume in the film, your food, your dress, and it can be the types of things we watch. So in The Castle, it's Hey, Hey, It's Saturday. All of those kinds of objects or texts that are inside the text go to shaping that identity as well. And there's also less visible, as you can see on the opposite side, where the idea of tradition, enculturation, and the norms that the society sets up for us are also there. But I want to hone in on with you rituals and behaviours, because to me, rituals, repetitive actions, repetitive behaviours, that is what language, identity, and culture is all about. So when you watch The Castle, what is it that you're seeing repetitively? Start to pick up those patterns and it'll start to create a kind of thematic connection for you. So this is the rubric that you've been given, or the module statement, let's call it, for standard module A. And I have highlighted a couple of words, a few more words that are key. You've got to look at how individual identities are shaped in that text, as well as collective identities. So you could have your father figure, but then that father figure might belong to a working class identity, a group. You've also got to look at the impact of the text. You are also being positioned. Your identity comes into how you read this text as well. So it's a text that also asks you, how much do you think this is an Australian text that you relate to as well? And in doing that, in asking that question, you're being asked to reflect on your own values and attitudes. The other thing you need to look at is, how is the text actually structured? And how does that structure also shape those three things, language, identity, and culture? And then we come to a really big one. As you can see, if you look at the module statement, it deepens as you go into the paragraph. And so if you look at that column over there, on my right side, how can text deepen your understanding of language? How can the text be used to affirm your assumptions? So you already had an idea and it's affirming that, and that's true. Ignore, what does it put in, what does it leave out? Reveal, and challenge or disrupt prevailing assumptions. And I really think a good way to look at this would be affirm and challenge. What did you walk into this text thinking and it was confirmed? And what did you walk into this text being challenged by? And now what do you think? This is what that interaction between the text is asking of you. So essentially, in a nutshell, we're looking at how language, what we see visually in the film and what we hear verbally, how is that shaping the thought processes of people in the film and possibly Australians outside the film watching that text? How does that thought then become our identity? And then how does that identity become our culture? So it's a three-part system. And I've put there for you, if you change the language that you use, you often change the identity and the culture, because they really are interconnected. And I've put an example or two examples there. If you want to take it broadly, women in film are often idolised for their beauty and their femininity. If we keep reinforcing that in films, what are we suggesting about what the culture values? And so if we want to change that, we need to show women in different ways of representation. Similarly, if we want to create a culture which is a very much divisive culture, an us versus them culture, we will continue to use language or visual cinematics that show that division. But if we want to challenge that, we will show solidarity, unity, and therefore hopefully change the culture. One of the ways I'm going to look at The Castle with you today is I'm going to look at the concept of conversations. The Castle is a huge text in terms of where we could go with it and what we could talk about. So I'm going to narrow the scope and deepen it. And what I mean by that is take it as a conversation, look at all the types of conversations we have in The Castle, and then broaden it again by looking at the types of conversations and where we can categorise them, because we don't know what the question is going to be on the day. So we have to be able to have broad understanding of the text, but also to go deep when necessary. And so one of the main focuses is in bold at the top there, conversations in private and public
lead to the formation of individual and collective identities. And if we look at the castle and the people in the castle, we do have affirmations of identities where we thought this would be the case, and it was. But we also have people disrupting the Australian identity, or maybe even the gendered identity. And so that's what we're going to look at today. How do the conversations in private and how do the conversations in public shape language, thought and identity? Let's look at private conversations first of all. So from the very beginning of the film, in that first shot, we see Dale, who is the son of Daryl Kerrigan, and he's pretty much our narrator for this particular text. The fact that he is talking to us in an intimate and confessional way already starts up a very private conversation, and that frames our understanding of family from the very beginning of the film. Using the word "my story" really foregrounds that personal narrative. And just by looking at the language that Dale is using, it's very simple, it's very concise, it suggests a working class background, it doesn't have the flowery language or the high formality of an overly educated person. But what we do appreciate is the kind of simple, honest way of approaching life that the Kerrigans have. The interesting thing to note is Salora, who was one of the writers, you can see his quote on the side. He basically said that the dialogue is actually based on conversations that Stitch, the director, had and he had with their own fathers. And so even though we see an individual identity here, it's connecting to a wider identity of sons and fathers and values of those children as well. And so when we start with private conversations, what am I actually going to look at? I'm going to look at how conversations in the home shape personal and familial identities, and those conversations then shape gender identities. So my question for you, and for something that you might want to consider, is, are identities constructed in the home and then they become part of society, or do identities start in the public domain and then they filter back into the home? Or, again, you may ask, are they a combination of both? And so this is the Kerrigan family. Obviously, there's Wayne, a brother in jail, but it is important for you to grab as many still shots of the film as you can, because sometimes it's impossible to keep watching the film over and over. So what you might want to do is grab a lot of main film stills and put them on a PowerPoint, and that way you can deconstruct them in your own time at a pace. What we see here straight away is that very much a patriarchal identity. You've got Daryl Kerrigan, straight centre, a very salient feature. It's setting up this identity of the patriarchal male, which is a strong feature in classic Australian films. And one of the things you need to be able to talk about with your film, as I said, is not just dialogue, but also the cinematic techniques. The voiceover, you need to show a combination of them. That's, I think, what the real skill is with talking about film. You've got straight away from the very beginning, Dad is the backbone of the Kerrigan family. And so that voiceover works in combination with the dad and son playing at the billiard table. And what it does is also shows the billiard table is that motif of construction and building that we see with the discourses of masculinity. Even though Daryl doesn't quite finish his renovations, he's constantly preoccupied with building and construction, which again is a stereotypical masculine activity. There's also the numerous references to the power lines, electricity, activity, and that foregrounds a hyper-masculine space as well. We also see that relationship that men have to objects, where they feminize them, and again, that can be seen as quite a conservative way of approaching an object. He's got the boat, who he calls Sea Lady, and again, that obsession with objects, that obsession with possession of objects. When he's centered in the middle during a scene where he's given a birthday present, again, the whole family is clamored around him. And so when you've got the voiceover of our family loves giving presents, who are they giving those presents to? To the male. So there's that idolization of the masculine. But even though he is quite masculine, and it's not a toxic masculinity as such, he still has a great respect for the women around him, his daughter and his wife, and that really makes him quite likable at the same time. The other kind of discourse of language that we see a lot in the castle is the discourse of commerce or of business, and that becomes the familiar feature of the trading post conversations in the family. One of the things that Australians love is this idea of finding a bargain. We're competitive, but we also love our thriftiness, and so we pride ourselves on being able to not be exploited in a sense. So we see a lot of the how much Helen is dreaming kind of conversation when it comes to purchasing objects from the trading post. And some of the objects that are ridiculous things, as I've put there, ergonomic chairs, jousting sticks, projector, although ergonomic chairs in these days when we're all at home Zooming and needing a good chair, maybe not so irrelevant. But what we see with the trading post is the idea of the son imitating the father. So the son has learnt to imitate the conversations of the father. And that is where we start to see that rituals and behaviours I was talking about earlier with the imitation of, behaviours, customs, values being carried on through the family. All right, besides the patriarchal identity, we've also got the female identity. And again, we know this is a close-knit family. The son loves the mum, but we really get this idea that the mum is other. And it's directly inferred in, if dad is the backbone, mum is the other bones. Now, again, some people reading this might see other as a marginalised thing or secondary to the male. Others may look at this and say, well, I think it actually means that she's holding them all together. So it does depend on your identity and your reading, how you might see this. But I'm going to look at the idea that she is quite valued, but she represents, again, a conservative view of women in the family. She's constantly defined in the domestic spaces, in the passive spaces, and she's praised again for her cooking. So what she does is affirm the working class identity of the way females are viewed in early Australia, a nostalgic view of women, I suppose. But we also need to remember that she is more than just Daryl's wife. She often makes comments that suggest she's quite perceptive and astute. She makes the comment, as I've written over there, it's odd because Farouk reckoned he had some bloke around as well. So where denial is happening with other people, she starts to be perceptive to something is coming. And I think that is quite praiseworthy of the female in this context. The other kinds of practices and rituals that we see in terms of genders being repeated is at Bonnie Doon. There's a great scene or cross-cutting scene from the site of masculinity, which is the fishing boat, again, often associated with the male identity, and the house with the females. And it's done not just in the dialogue, but also in the music. So when the men appear on screen, they have adventure music, fast-paced music. And then when the director cuts to the women in the house, it's silent and they're engaging in conversation. So I've written there, very importantly, the visual language is affirming the traditional gender identities, but I should have added that the sound is also doing that as well. But in this conversation, this is the cut where we see the fishing, then we cut to this particular film still here. We start to see a disruption to the identity of the female because Tracy confesses that she's delaying having children, she wants a career. And we start to see the emergence of a new Australia through Tracy. And the other thing we start very importantly to notice is that Con is down at the shops, a stereotypically female ritual. So Tracy and Con's relationship is quite synonymous with an emerging Australia. Whereas Dale and Daryl have the traditional masculine relationship there. And I guess in terms of a marriage, Sal and Daryl have your conservative one. Later on, we see the mise-en-scene of Tracy holding the punching bag for Con. So again, is that a reversal? Is that a submission, or is that a shared thing? How do you see it? That's something you can consider yourself. And we really know that there has been a disruption to identity just in the mother's comment, the mother's dialogue. All times have changed, at least for Tracy, but then the director cuts straight back to the boat showing, not for the men here. There's another disruption that we see, and that is in the wedding scene. If you look at the wedding still on the PowerPoint, you'll see that in the centre is Tracy and Con. On either side, squashing them in, is Dale and Daryl. And Con is the person squeezing into this relationship. Now, the thing with Daryl is that although he says things, you have to look at language in context and language in character, because his comment, "You'd like your daughter to marry one of your own," can be quite insulting. But because Daryl has been set up as a likeable character in other ways in the film, he kind of gets away with that as part of his humour. And basically that's why he's honest to the point of political correctness. But that's where language in context does matter. If someone else was to say that, would we respond to this in the same way? So what can we conclude from conversations in the home? And again, I'm imagining that this is an essay. I've started with my thesis, I've given my evidence, and now I'm ending on my conclusion. I don't just want it to be a summary. I want it to be something a little bit more significant. So texts reveal how the home is the site of cultural practices, where the link between personal and familial identity is achieved through imitation. However, new identities or emerging identities, like we saw with Con and Tracy, can be formed in these private spaces through the emergence of new conversations about personal ambitions in a changing world or in a changing Australia. So that therein is private conversations. Let's have a look at part 2, which is conversations in the public space. Our main focus here was to look at how the conversations in public spaces reinforce those social divisions in Australia and the inequalities we see. But it's not all bad. They also offer spaces for inclusivity. The first kind of conversation that we see in a sort of public semi-private space is Daryl's conversation with authority. This section really is the individual versus authority, this conversation in public. So the first authority figure, I guess, is the police. And although the police represent authority, they're also more associated with the working class identity. And so we see that kind of officer trying to bridge that gap. You can see in his language, the way he abbreviates Daryl to Daz. I know you did it. No one wants to see you get the rough end of the stick. Even the language is idiomatic, suggesting a connection to the working class. And the fact that the police officer visually is kind of straddling two worlds. He's looking at trying to connect to Daryl, working class, but he also has to represent the wider community. So we see that public conversation happening in that instance. Then we see another type of public conversation with the councilman. He's the first indication of that tear in the fabric of Daryl's world, Daryl's perfect world, his utopia. And you can see that with, but one day a knock on the door was to change all that. And so the councilman, he comes across as quite innocuous, but really he means business. He's come there to value the property, and it's the value of the property that starts the exposition, the real conversation of this text. We've also got assumptions about corporate and government power. Dennis is very much sharing Daryl's identity, because both of them view authority figures or the rich as different to them. But Dennis has a little bit more, he's more cluey about the power relationships in society. His direct statements, Daryl, they write the rules, they own the game, suggests that he's very aware of the deceptive cultural practices in institutions. obviously Daryl's not deceptive, he's very straightforward and honest, so he's the one we're going to barrack for. We also have representations of the lawyer. Now, the lawyer is quite representative of the upper class. He's from Hammersley and Laycock. When he first looks for Dennis Denuto, let's take that back a little bit, actually. He receives the letter from Dennis Denuto. Its language is the language of his people. And when I say his people, the formal, upper class, educated, high class, rich elite. And then we see the contrast with his face when he actually goes to look for Dennis Denuto's office, and it's squashed in between, again, a very kind of pedestrian suburb. And he smirks because he thought the language got him in, but realises that maybe he's dealing with a small-time dealer here. So Dennis's language has actually equalised him, but the geography of where Dennis lives has made him seem inferior to the lawyer. All right, let's move on. To the lawyer, basically, this is an important conversation in terms of a public conversation, because the lawyer pretends, again, like the councilman, that he's innocuous through his language, but there's the surface level language and then there's the nuances of that language. I would advise Mr. Kerrigan against taking further action when really he's creating a threat. Educated people talk in nuances and inferences. Daryl, who's quite simple, says it directly. And again, that is probably why we feel more comfortable with Daryl. He says, tell them to get stuffed, rather than, I don't think this is the correct thing. He's just interested in what he believes he's entitled to. A question that we do need to ask at this point, though, and this goes back to the idea of what kinds of things does the text ignore, and that is that the film ignores the backstory of the rich upper class characters. They're often presented in very flat ways. They don't have a backstory, they don't have depth, they're merely figures of collective identities. And so we need to take this into consideration when we're considering whether the text itself represents all of Australia and whether it does so fairly. So with the collective versus the individual, Daryl feels that his cultural perspective of what's fair is a collective perspective, which is why he becomes so frustrated. He believes that, you can't just walk in and take a man's house, is something that should be law for everybody, and is quite surprised to find that he can't just make that statement and have no argument to back it up. His statement is the argument. So Daryl comes across as quite frustrated, and that's where he utters in exasperation, it's the law of bloody common sense. And his tone is irreverent, but that irreverence is not coming from being challenging or disruptive. It's the frustration of the fact that this is being questioned. His whole way of life is being questioned. His beliefs and attitudes are being questioned. But the law works in the opposite way in terms of it needs that convoluted argument to persuade. And that's where Daryl needs language from elsewhere to support him. Dennis tries to be that person that comes in and provides that language from elsewhere, but Daryl and Dennis are quite similar in that they operate on the surfaces of that society. Dennis is quite a nice guy, but he's clueless. He's simple in terms of the lawyer field. He does small things compared to the QC Lawrence, and he skirts around that knowledge. So both Daryl, Farouk and Dennis understand language, but then don't understand how to use that language in the same way that the upper class do to get what they want. But again, Sitch is showing us that sometimes there are challenges to our assumptions, because even though we had that representation of the rich and their arrogance and their discompassionate nature, he introduces us to QC Lawrence, and Lawrence disrupts those assumptions. The other lawyers and the councilman affirms those assumptions, but Daryl's friend Lawrence disrupts those assumptions. We see them strike up a conversation outside the law courts. Daryl assumes he's there because his son is possibly in a criminal situation. But basically what happens is, obviously he learns that the QC's son is actually a lawyer too. And in fact, QC Lawrence has got a lot of tools that can be used to advance Daryl's situation. What we see here though is a very down-to-earth Aussie. We see a lawyer who shares an egalitarian attitude, equal, everybody's equal. And so we warm to QC Lawrence in the way that we don't warm to the lawyers with their nuanced language. So what we see here is two fathers connecting. We don't see social class, and that's their identity in that moment. And so as these guys go to battle it out, you've got Dennis Denuto, the migrant Australian, you've got your working class male, and then you've got your upper class male, and they're on the quest to bring down big business here. We see the power of language through Daryl's own words when he basically turns to Laurie as he listens to him summing up at the end and says to him, "I wish I had your words." But the irony of that is, even though he doesn't have the formality of Lawrence's words, Lawrence has used Daryl's words as part of the argument. And perhaps he doesn't have the language. Perhaps Lawrence has the identity that is needed to be accepted by the court. And together they create that advancement. So there's lots of motifs of reconciliation in this film, and I think this is one of them. The bringing together of class, the bringing together of males across classes, as well as the issue of reconciliation from race relations as well. We also see that friendship being cemented when Daryl basically says at the end, "Thanks, Loz." Lawrence has turned to Loz in the very familiar way of greeting a friend, where you abbreviate the name in an affectionate way. Lastly, we see the conversation at the very end when Daryl does win his case, and it's not necessarily being rude, but it is showing an irreverent attitude to the manners or the rituals or the customs of the court place, when he basically turns to them and says, "You little ripper, thanks lads," approaching the judges in a very colloquial way. And the reaction shot of the judges shows that. But again, that's just something that makes Daryl more likeable and more Australian, more down to earth in that concept. So what can we conclude in terms of conversations in the public spaces? And what we can conclude is that language can be used to empower us or disempower us. It can be used as a cross-cultural interface between class and race, or it can be used to reinforce exclusivity. So again, your thesis, your sections of things you can talk about, and then your conclusion. Part 3 is cultural conversations. So we're looking at that idea in cultural conversations that cultural conversations foreground not just the ignorance of some Australian parts of Australian society. You've got to be careful not to say all of Australian society, because this is quite a film which has layers to it. And so if I ever say that, I apologise for that. But really, I should be really want to hone in on this idea of the layered Australian identity. And the other thing that cultural conversations really point out to us in this text is the tension of belonging to an evolving Australia. First of all, we've got the representation of ethnicity, and that there is, again, a lovable ethnic identity of Baruch, who is one of Daryl's neighbours. But the question here is that, is Baruch's representation, is Con's representation too simplistic? And I want to take you back to the idea of the genre. Comedy is often known for using those surface identities and for using stereotypes to make fun of a situation, to satirise a situation or a type of identity given to people. So perhaps it is simplistic, but it belongs to that comedy genre, the form, which is identifying humour as based on those stereotypes. It's not necessarily a cinematic art house piece which is going to go into depth about a particular issue. So that's possibly why those representations are simplistic. Con, who is Tracy's husband, he is very much, he's the cultural interface, I think. You've got Daryl welcoming him into the family. He's only loved because Tracy loves him. And so, as Daryl says, anyone who loves our Trace as much as us deserves our love. He's allowing for that cultural identity to be merging into the traditional Australian identity. And again, he gets away with saying things like, could you stop busting all them plates, because he is who he is. If a redneck Australian person said, could you bust all them plates, perhaps we wouldn't be taking this the same way. But the question is, should that be allowed anyway? And that's where you need to come in as your particular perspective with your personal reflection on that as well. So Con's desire to show off with his language, where he constantly uses formal language when it's not necessary, again shows him trying to use language to be inclusive, or at least to add a sense of superiority, because the migrant is often felt as other. So, you know, and they come off as being quite humorous. Can I just say how disenchanted I am with our legal system? And that's not necessary in a private conversation in the home. You can just say that sucks, or that's an awful situation to be in. You don't need the disenchanted with the legal system. That's just suggesting an identity that's not right in the context of that conversation. We also have the cultural conversations about places, which form a source of humour in the film. But we have Thailand in terms of a place that Con and Tracy go to. Then we have the familiar, we had a choice between fish and beef Wellington. These are not really choices of a cultural experience. They're pretty much British culture still in the same spot. They're still having the same things they would always have, just maybe in a different geographical place. So they think they're having a cultural experience, but really they're just choosing very similar things that they've always been used to. So that's the attitude that some Australians have about culture experience. We also see that in the films that they watch, the fact that Con suggests that there's a 24-hour boxing, kickboxing channel. So they've gone to this beautiful exotic place and they've ended up with a Rolex for 15 bucks from a guy on the beach. And again, that he'd said he'd mailed on the warranty later points to the simple nature of the family. The interesting thing about this though is that conversation about Thailand then is followed by Bonnie Doon. And Bonnie Doon is referred to as a beautiful place. But the dialogue contrasts with the images of Bonnie Doon, which looks like a very barren, arid place. The water's gone down, and that's created the ability to inhabit the place. Again, there's power lines, this obsession with the power lines there too. Daryl places scorched meat on the plate. And again, you've got the image contrasting with the dialogue, creating that difference. I bet they don't have places like this. It's the culture, the place is full of culture. I would argue that Con has become very much Australian because he now lacks the very thing we associate with simple types of Australian stereotypes, which is the fact that they have no understanding of culture, at least within the text of this film. Last thing we're going to look at today is this idea of myth-making conversations. And a lot of value systems of Australians deal with this identity type of the battler, the underdog, the person who is facing obstacles and develops resilience and endurance as a result of that. Collective conversations. So main thesis for this one is this idea of collective conversations create community valued identities centred on the battler and the underdog myths. So the battler is a person who, again, battler and underdog are closely associated with the working class mentality or identity. A battler is someone who overcomes obstacles and adversity and often associated with the landscape, not even the suburbs. So Sitch has taken this very much rural identity and inculcated it into a suburban identity to look at how the modern battler might look like there. And the underdog, again, is someone who is not expected to overcome a very difficult situation or a situation where they appear inferior, but then they manage to overcome that. That David versus Goliath, the idea of the little guy versus the big guy. So public and private conversations cultivate and foster our view of the ideal Australian identities, and I put there resilience, egalitarianism and fairness. The classic example that students often will use when they talk about the battler and the underdog in the castle is this quote here, where Daryl directly says, this is an example of the individual. If he has the guts to stand up and shove it right up those people who think they can stand on top of you. And this is where we do relate to him. We relate to the idea of the individual versus authority, but right here, the idea of the underdog and the battler coming through. But where the humour lies is the fact that Daryl's fighting words are matched with bringing in not the big guns, which he says, they're only the big guns, I'm going to hit them with the big artillery, and brings in Dennis Denuto, who can't even manage to operate a photocopier, who types his own, who talks his own letters into the dictaphone and then types them out instead of giving them to the secretary. So he's nowhere near a big gun. But that is how Daryl thinks of him. And that's, again, what makes him quite a likeable fellow. So we see the contrast between the heroic characterisation of Dennis as given to him by Daryl, which again is a very Australian thing to do, to exaggerate the qualities and the heroism of their friends. And we see that contrasted with the incompetency of Dennis Denuto, and that contrast is what creates the humour here. Dennis, however, remains rightly realistic. It's over my head, it's over your head too. But sometimes heroes or underdogs are made by removing assumptions about what's over our heads. And that's why Daryl comes in as this persistent, enduring, resilient man who is overcoming assumptions and testing the Goliath in the midst. And we see that kind of motif coming through very clearly in the architecture in the movie. We see that in the buildings, the way that each time the heroes progress through this story, they actually, we're shown a bigger and bigger building to reference that idea of the underdog, but also the hero's journey and obstacles. So the archetypal hero structure of leaving the ordinary world, entering the belly of the beast, overcoming that beast, and then returning home a changed person, with the elixir, in this case, of family and stability, is very much the structure of the castle. At first, we see the cut to the low angle of the municipal offices, and we know that low angles often show things of power. It is intimidating. It does have noisy traffic. There's discordant, ugly sounds around, and it creates a sense of suffocation and claustrophobia. The buildings themselves are synonymous with the obstacles, as I've written there, and again, darkened interiors. And if you contrast that with the Kerrigan's natural lighting in the kitchen, we're quickly made to be positioned to see the identity of the institutions as alienating, and Daryl and his family as intimate, connected with us. And so the building will increase in size as the hero proceeds to endure the obstacles. There's a cut to the next imposing architectural landscape. Again, this time we've got a low angle, same concept to demonstrate power as an identity or relationships between the individual and authority. There's glass panels this time, which actually reflect onto other buildings, creating more of a sense of intimidation. And I've written there, culturally, these architectural facades speak of power and organisation. So the code the audience has been given to understand the power dynamic that's being set up here is being used through the camera language. Camera tilts up to show the most imposing building so far, which represents the meta-narrative of the archetypal hero. And this is the Supreme Court. The three men are standing outside the Supreme Court. The central male that we're focused on is Daryl. Then we've got the upper class white male, and then we've got the migrant male. Again, referencing this hypermasculine text really is more about the men than it is about the women. The rule of thirds, you can see you've got the real power top, which is the building, and the men are placed directly underneath. But because the vector is running from Dennis to Daryl, again, it's telling us what is the central piece here, or who is the central persona. Trumpet music, again, there's sound telling us how to feel and how to relate to these people. Trumpet music plays as if the men are embarking on a new horizon. But not only the men are underdogs, the whole community becomes an underdog in this narrative. You've got, and there's a still photo of Farouk, Jack and Yvonne in the garage. It's given a humorous angle because you've got the chiaroscuro lighting coming through, which is the black and white blind thing that we often see in dark, sinister cop movies, creating a sense of conspiracy. But really, these are just the neighbours. They don't have much money. They don't have much control over their situation. They're building a conspiracy to bring down an institution. This is how they're bringing back their control. It's also here in this scene that Farouk talks about manipulating stereotypes, where he says that, you know, he had a visit from a thug from Airlink, associated with Airlink, and he tells them that he's going to throw a bomb at him or something along those lines. Again, could we use that language in a post 9/11 context? It might have seemed funny in that context, but not so funny in a post 9/11 climate. So watching this film back, even that type of conversation that we have probably changes in that context. But back to the underdog aspect. So the whole community is an underdog because all of these figures are what we would consider battlers. All of these figures are what we would consider underdogs when we compare them to big institutions or corporate government, corporate business. All right. So we also see, in terms of an underdog, Wayne being trapped in jail. There's always this reference of Wayne sitting on his bed, looking up at the wall. The family photo is there, and railings are reflected from the prison, showing that he's stuck in here. And again, an institution is keeping him away from the family, even though it was his fault because he robbed a store. Daryl then makes his association with the Aboriginal community. I'm really starting to understand how the Aborigines feel. This house is like their land. It holds their memories. The land is their story. It's everything. This country's got to stop stealing other people's land. And although it seems like a far-fetched connection, because the Aborigines have been through a lot more than I suppose Daryl has, the connection he's making about home and stability and cultural practices and memories that create identity is very clearly connected. And so we do need to take that in consideration. The other myth-making identity that we start to see come through is the idea of the larrikin, who is often associated with, again, the Aussie male, but the person has to be kind of mischievous, but not in an overly criminal way. They can't have done anything so graphic. It's cheekiness bordering on criminality. In this case, we see that in a couple of ways when the councilman comes in and Daryl says to him, what's this about? Is this about the dogs? Is this about the aerial? Is this about the extensions? Is this about the truck on the nature strip? So that constant breaking or challenging of the law, the dogs, the aerial extensions, shows that Daryl is the kind of person that flirts with those boundaries. Then he enters a little bit more of the criminality where he actually steals the gates of Airlink. But again, because of Daryl and who he is and why he's such a lovable person, the Australian criminality gets associated with larrikinism and somehow becomes a redemptive feature of the Aussie identity. We also have the Bogan identity, who with the love of the superficial, and one of the most aspects that we start to see is this idea of plastic, fake chimney, lattice, which gives it a Victoriana feel. So Daryl is always trying to one-up himself by adding these features, but they're not authentic. The only authentic thing is Daryl himself. That is the irony here. We do see a medium shot of Daryl in his costumed identity, where we see the Ugg boots and the flannel shirt, very much associated with the costume and dress of the cultural Bogan. And the Bogan is often associated with the ordinary hero, where the ordinary has become epic. Rather than a warrior spirit that we would see with ancient Greek myths, this is a very much heroic thing turned on its head, where the ordinary becomes extraordinary in a text. And the collective Bogan identity is filtered right throughout the film in things like the pool room and what's put in the pool room, dinners in front of television shows, the greyhounds. I need to get the Tirana out so I can get the Commodore types of cars you associate with that type of identity. So the social capital that's shared between the working class. Working class, Bogan, very synonymous. Not that all working class are Bogans. Reading literature, TV Week is read, Price is Right is watched, and so is Hey Hey It's Saturday. So the kinds of cultural practices and rituals they go through create their identity, shape their identity, as is the food that they eat. So the conclusion of myth making is that language, whether it's spoken, whether it's visual, whether it's sound, goes towards the construction of myth making, where the individual's qualities then become symbolic of the collective identity they represent. I think it's important to note that the film content, what happens in the film in terms of the plot, storyline, is paralleling the form of that film and the genre of that film. I've already talked about the 3 acts. Well, I haven't really, but I've talked about the archetypal hero representation. It's fit into a 3-act structure. You've got a complication, you've got the rising of and the meeting of the challenges, and then you've got the resolution. Most films will use a 3-act structure. In terms of form, you've also got the comedy genre, and the reason the comedy genre is quite an acceptable genre to explore the changing and evolving tensions of Australian identity is because it makes fun of the things that sometimes are quite difficult to talk about, and that's the uncomfortable truth. It's also part of the realism genre. It has the look and the sound of suburbia, although it takes all those mythic and heroic qualities of the battler and the underdog and gives it a suburban feel. And the other important thing to look at with this particular film is that it's very much a holiday family video, not a holiday video, a family video, a home video. It's set up like that, and that creates the novice-like documentary feel. It's authentic, it's laid-back storytelling. It looks low budget because it is low budget, but it's also a working class film. It is told by a working class persona. He holds the camera to himself almost at the very beginning and at the end. And so there's no pretentiousness of anything but simple, straightforward cinematic techniques. And again, that home video is reinforcing that value of the family identity. All right, so in terms of the film, that's really going broad but deep in terms of the concepts of conversations that we see in that. But to even deepen your understanding a little bit more of this text, I've put some personal reflection questions that you might want to consider. You might have these in a discussion with friends when you're studying, or even with your teacher. Having a look at some, compare your view of Australians with the Australians in the classroom. Is it too simplistic? Is it too comfortable? Does it not suggest a little bit more about the murkiness of Australian culture or Australian race relations? How have assumptions about cultures been affirmed or disrupted? Write your own little mini essay plan about that. How is your family different or similar to the Kerrigans? And on the side here, we've got an Australia Day Council of New South Wales in 2010 did a survey where it said 37% of respondents believed that the castle best represents who we are. Is that in agreement with what you think? And again, this could be done as a persuasive or discursive speech that you can practice for Module C. Let's have a look at last year's HSC question in terms of how do you go about deconstructing this question. And the question, which was question 5, was film relies primarily on dialogue to create cultural tension. The first thing you need to be doing when you look at this question is looking at what is the cultural tension. Is the what's the culture? first of all, that you want to look at. What's the tension between those cultures? And I think I've written 2 focus areas there. I really think the tension between the social classes is very important. Upper versus working class, the individual versus authority, because authority is often associated with the upper class. And the debate on reconciliation is also important in terms of reconciling those classes, but also the race relations debate that is brought in there. So after figuring out what is the cultural tension that you're going to talk about, also look at the word primarily, because that means mostly. And if film is largely a visual text, do you agree with this statement? Could you say, for instance, that film does rely primarily on dialogue, but it also includes? Or do you think it's a combination of the 2? So you need to think about what your perspective on that statement. Do I agree or do I not agree? And a very magic phrase that you make sure you have to look at is, to what extent do you agree? So it's not just asking you yes or no, it's asking you to evaluate how much you agree. To a significant extent, or is cinematic language to a lesser extent? So these are the things you have to sort of consider before you start to make your plan and breaking up your essay. The general feedback from the Marking Centre, if you have a look at that, you'll see what they wanted students to do and what students could do to improve. Again, it's engaging with the keywords, focusing on the identified technique. So the technique in there was dialogue. So you would expect a large part of the essay to deal with that. Providing supporting textual evidence. So your quotes, your techniques, your detailed references to scenes, demonstrate knowledge and understanding of the module, establish a clear line of argument. So even if you take 5 minutes, no more than 5 minutes, to set up a quick essay plan in terms of your intro, 3 body paragraphs that you might want to look at, and a conclusion, take that time, and that will allow you to develop a clear line of argument. Acknowledge to what extent is referred to as before. And I think the areas for students to improve in, then honed in on 4 main ones that you can see there. So if you're looking at your essay and you're writing an essay, mark your essay going back and looking at the general feedback. Does my essay respond to all the keywords? Does it establish a clear line of argument? Does it use detailed, accurate knowledge of the prescribed text? And have I stated explicitly to what extent I think it is the case? In better responses, this is again from the Marking Centre, the HSC Marking Centre from last year. The better responses, students did demonstrate how the dialogue reveals cultural tension, and they looked at challenging notions of racial or class stereotypes. They did demonstrate how other film techniques, including songs, voiceovers, and film shots, support the dialogue of the film to highlight the cultural tension. And they explored the cultural tensions faced by characters in the text, and again, racial tensions and socio-economic tensions. Writing an essay, how do you go about doing it? You can do it around characters. So here's a thesis to a potential question. The language we use or fail to use can reflect our status. Language can serve as access into certain contexts or reinforce our exclusion from these contexts. So I would pick Daryl, and how does Daryl's language reflect his status? Dennis's language and how that reflects his status. And then Lawrence's and how that can give us status as well. Our language merges when our intentions merge. If we value justice and fairness, we can end up speaking the same language. That might be something you move towards concluding. So you can either decide to write your essay around characters, especially if you have a good solid understanding of that, and then incorporate other aspects of language into that. Or you can write your essay around concepts, as I did with conversations. But in this case, I've chosen reconciliation. Language can reinforce parallel identities, as we saw with the losing of the home and the cultural memories for Daryl and the Indigenous issue. And they can lead to an exploration on the concept of reconciliation, reconciling social classes, and the building of new relationships, which is cultural relationships. So I could look at reconciliation through Daryl's reality of losing his home in one paragraph. I could look at Daryl's emerging relationship with Lawrence in a second paragraph, and I could look at cultural integration of Tracy and Con in my third paragraph. And so that's part of how I would plan my essay before I go back into the mud and find the actual quotes and techniques. And lastly, just make sure it is, yep, lastly, just some ideas if you're practicing this Module A by connecting to Module C and your expectations of writing, you might want to think about how you would explore any one of those stimulus type questions. Okay, you might want to rewrite the opening of your prescribed text, foregrounding a specific aspect about the main character. What if Dale wasn't the person to open the castle? What if it was Sal's story? How might that differ? And so you could write the opening using Sal or Farouk even. How must it feel for, I mean, we don't see any part of Farouk's family. So what would Farouk's story look like? And how might you bring in a voice quite different to Dale's? Or QC Lawrence even. Explore the conflict in a scene from the perspective of a marginalised character. Adopt the voice and perspective of this character. Again, what might, how might Jack feel in a particular instance? Or how might Farouk feel? Or Con at the wedding? How might Con feel when Daryl is speaking? Does he feel included? Is there a level of inclusion and exclusion? Explore your take on modern identities through this lens. You might also like to write a speech which explores the complexity of identity through a shifting situation or experience. So if you had to write a creative piece, something has happened which has shifted your assumption about your identity or someone else's identity, and where and how could you explore that? And lastly, I see this more as a kind of discursive piece. Argue that alienation in society is part of being human, irrespective of whether we have a mainstream or a marginalised identity. So at all points, alienation will be felt by individuals, irrespective of the class, the race, the gender. Is that a possible discursive piece you might want to explore? And so that brings us to the conclusion of this presentation. And I hope that you feel that you've been given some areas and angles to explore and have a kind of deeper understanding in terms of the scope of learning that you're supposed to be looking at for this module. I'd like to thank everybody for listening, and also hope that you stay safe during this climate, and it can be quite testing for you guys, but you're also going to be building resilience and endurance throughout as a result. Stay safe. Thank you very much.